Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, it's the post-game pod from the Wolves. Matinee lost to the LA Clippers on Sunday. We'll talk about really kind of the key themes from the weekend overall. Some similarities from Friday's loss to the Kings and Sunday's close loss to the Clippers. We'll break the whole thing down. We'll talk a little about the rotation. We'll talk about some of the defensive issues and also the turnover issues again on offense. We'll also look at individual studs and duds from Sunday and kind of, what have the last two games told us about this Wolves team here moving forward? It's all come and welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Happy Monday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic weekend. Unfortunately for the Wolves, they went 0 for 2, or 0 and 2, I guess, over the weekend. Friday and Sunday, close losses to playoff teams. Friday night in overtime to the Kings, and then a single-point loss to the Clippers on Sunday. We'll mostly focus on the Clippers game today, but I do want to give a couple of thoughts. We haven't had a regular show since Friday's game. Hopefully you've been listening or watching the live postcast following the games with Luke and Jack and Tyler, but I want to give a couple of my thoughts kind of intermixed here because there were similarities from Friday's loss to the Kings and Sunday's loss to the Clippers. So we'll spend most of today talking about that. A big thank you here off the top for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CK. All right, so the Wolves lost in overtime to the Kings on Friday. Most recently, they lost a matinee to the Clippers by a single point in a weirdly low-scoring 89-88 game on Sunday. And I want to kind of start there, and then it's not hard to link these two games together. On Sunday, the short version of what happened was the Wolves were up 12 at the end of the first quarter, and really they were extremely dominant throughout the first quarter. It was the sort of quarter, and I said something to this effect on Twitter, on X. I posted this, I think around halftime of the game on Sunday. The Timberwolves' ability to just completely shut down an opponent's offense is something that should travel in the playoffs. It's traveled all season long. And as lackadaisical as the defense was for stretches against the Kings on Friday, they locked in on Sunday. And in the first quarter, the Clippers could not score. It was incredible. If you go back and if you go back and watch what the Wolves defense did, just filling gaps, contesting on the perimeter, Gobert was getting out and contesting, recovering and protecting the paint. Like, it was just an incredible defensive display in the first quarter. And they were up 30-15, and then Terrence Mann just hits a nutso three-pointer, and he did I think he made one at the end of the third quarter too. He banked one in. He had a buzzer beater at the end of the first quarter, and that was kind of what set off the Clippers offensively. The Wolves were still up 12 at the end of the first, but then in the second quarter, the Wolves just gave everything right back and then some. And Minnesota was down 3 at halftime after leading by 12 at the end of the first. And I think led by as many as 16 in the first quarter. But defensively, Minnesota was so impressive in quarter number one. They were bad on both ends in the second quarter. And then the second half was really just kind of a war of attrition between the two teams. Both teams actually played very well defensively. And it was more about the defensive performance for both teams than it was about offensive ineptitude. And it's hard nowadays to look at a game where neither team breaks 90 and say there wasn't bad offense. And certainly the Wolves have their issues, and we'll talk about that. But this was just really good defense. And the Clippers aren't a bad defensive team. They're pretty middle of the pack in by most metrics. and obviously have some incredible individual defenders led by Kawhi Leonard, but overall just a solid defensive team. The first thing that stands out to me, well, let me start here because this is the most obvious, and then I want to get into some rotation stuff because I do want to assign a little bit of blame to Chris Finch, and I usually am I like to think of myself as level-headed when it comes to evaluating pretty much everything. I think most people like to see themselves that way, but I try to be pretty pragmatic about things. And I would call myself a Chris Finch apologist compared to how a lot of folks treat Chris Finch, we'll say online. But I think there's some blame to point out here in both games, the Kings game and the Clippers game, in terms of how rotations were handled. So I want to talk a little bit about that in a minute. First, though, let's talk about the obvious stuff, right? I think it's so obvious, but it also, we can't ignore it because it's this massive. Fast break points. The Timberwolves were outscored 19-0 in fast break points on Friday. They were also outscored 19-0 in fast break points on Sunday. You got that right. 19-0 in both games. A combined 38-0 in fast break points. They lost to the Kings on Friday and the Kings on Friday, Clippers on Sunday. So a combined 38-0. Okay? It's weird. First of all, it's weird, period. Like, no context needed. That's a weird thing to happen to any team ever, to somehow score both simultaneously, have no fast break points as a team in consecutive games. I'd be curious, Elias Sports Bureau, I'd be curious to know how often has that happened, period, in the NBA ever, even especially in today's NBA. Second of all, to give up that many fast break points. And the Wolves are overall, obviously, the league's best defense. They're also very good in transition. They're not a bad transition. Actually, let me say it this way. They're not a bad offensive transition team. They're pretty middle of the pack. But they are a good defensive transition team. The Timberwolves right now, well, I should say, this is cleaning the glass. So this was from Sunday prior to the Clippers game, but including the Kings game when they gave up 19 points in transition. Minnesota was 5th in the league in points per 100 possessions, or points added per 100 possessions in transition defense. 5th in the entire league. They're 9th in frequency, meaning they don't allow it a whole lot, and they're 8th in points per 100 plays. So combined, the points added plus per 100 possessions, the Timberwolves are 5th in the entire league. Okay? They are a good transition team. It was an issue last year, no question. We've talked about that on the show. I harped on it all last season. They've been a good transition team this year defensively. So it's uncharacteristic for them to allow 19 points in consecutive games. They allow teams to run a little bit more off of steals than they do off of rebounds, and that is directly in correlation to the next point we'll get to, which is the Wolves' turnover issues, because they obviously turn the ball over a ton, the Wolves do, and it's also a lot of live ball turnovers. Like, we saw a couple of these. There was an Ant one late in the game against the Clippers where he just threw the ball where he thought Gobert was going to be, and it wasn't close. The Clippers got a free layup in a game where neither team scored 90 points. Like, a free bucket in a close late game like that, that's being played in this way, a rock fight really, is really significant. And Ant wasn't the only one. The Wolves had careless turnovers in both of these games, and it fed into these transition points. On the flip side of things, I don't want to let the transition offense off the hook either, because in case you didn't notice, the Wolves scored 88 points in their loss on Sunday. The Wolves' transition offense coming into the game Sunday is 15th in the league. It's not that bad. It's actually better than their overall offensive rank. They don't run a lot. And this is, I talked about this a couple weeks ago, maybe a week and a half ago. I spent, a half show talking about this. The Wolves are actually dead last in their frequency of running in transition. They only run in transition 12.7% of the time. The league's best teams are closer to 20%. So this is 2 or 3 possessions a game. That matters, right? But get this, points per 100 plays in transition, the Wolves are number 2 in the league. So when they do run, they are efficient and they are effective. They are the second best team in points per 100 plays on offense in transition, but they are dead last in frequency. And that lends itself to a middle of the pack team in terms of overall impact at the end of the day. The Wolves do not run enough in transition, and it hurt them this weekend. And I don't want to go super like in the weeds on this like I did a week and a half ago, but they actually run a fair amount off of steals, which maybe isn't a surprise, but they're middle of the pack there. They're dead last in running off of defensive rebounds, live defensive rebounds. They're dead last in frequency. They only run 20% of the time off of defensive rebounds. And for a team whose half-court offense has struggled and been as discombobulated as it has been for stretches this season, including on Sunday, they got to get out in transition. They got to run. They got to get the easy buckets. They've got athletes. They've got shooters. They've got guys who hit trail threes that can make open threes. The other thing we talked about a week and a half ago is they just need to up the frequency of above the break three-point attempts. They get corner three-point attempts. They could stand to make a few more of those, but just taking more threes in general. Run in transition. Get a cat trail three. And cat, shoot the ball. Don't pump fake and drive into an offensive foul. Shoot the ball. The biggest issue here this weekend was overall transition, offense and defense. I want to talk about turnovers because that obviously plays into this thing, at least on the defensive end. Then I want to talk a little bit of rotations. We will do studs and duds from the Clippers game as well. So all that is coming up here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Coming into Monday night's game, the Wolves are playing host to the Trailblazers, the final game of a 7-game homestand for Minnesota. Portland, of course, has been awful all year. They've been bad of late. The Wolves have beaten them a couple of times. The Wolves are 14.5-point favorites. 14.5-point favorites at home on the second night of a back-to-back on Monday night. Of course, it was a Sunday afternoon game, so they get a little more than 24 hours of rest. And they beat Portland twice in Portland right before the All-Star break. So, yes. Oh, and the other thing is the Wolves have not lost 3 games in a row all year. If they lost to Portland, it would be a pretty, I would say, devastating 3-game losing streak as far as 3-game losing streaks go. But anyway, 14.5-point favorites on Monday night against the Blazers, according to our friends at FanDuel. You can bet on all your favorite NBA players and teams with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube, and now it's also available on Amazon Fire TV and the free Fire TV channels app. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find Locked On Sports Today now available on the free Fire TV channels app. And you can see it there on the bottom if you're watching on YouTube. Again, Amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV to learn more. All right. So we talked about transition on both ends of the floor not being good for the Wolves against the Kings on Friday or against the Clippers on Sunday. Turnovers, which have been a season-long issue. The Wolves continue to be one of the league's worst teams, regardless of where you look. They're either 28th, I think, on Clean the Glass, or 30th on Basketball Reference in terms of turnover rate. The Wolves, again, well, the number is I use this word a lot when I talk about the Timberwolves keeping their turnovers in this range. Palatable. They turned the ball over what? I think 12 times against the Kings. Yeah, 12 times against the Kings, or 13 times against the Kings, and like 13 times, I believe, on Sunday as well against the Clippers. Overall, for the weekend, the Timberwolves committed 28 turnovers between the two games. So I guess one of those numbers I just had was off, but 28 total turnovers between the Sacramento game and the Clippers game. And they only forced 17 opponent turnovers. They were a -11 in the turnover category between the two games. So they were out fast breaked 38-0 and out turnovered 17 opponent turnovers to 28 Timberwolves turnovers. Obviously, turning the ball over offensively has a direct impact on opponent transition opportunities. I'm not going to give the points off turnover number. I think that's a little bit, sometimes it's a little, I don't know, I think it's noisy, right? Like there's some flukiness involved. But when you take the overall, bucket of turnovers and then fast break points, you can kind of infer there. Cause like the way I see it is like a dead ball turnover by the Wolves, and then the other team scores, coming down in a half court set. Like, I don't know. Yes, it's a quote unquote point off turnover, but it's not a direct correlation, right? It's more the overall fast break points, the over turnovers. and the overall turnovers. And you certainly can draw a straight line from the Timberwolves live ball turnovers and opponent fast break points. And again, overall, their defense has been good on fast breaks. But as we said a moment ago, the Timberwolves have been fantastic in transition defense off of rebounds. They have been mediocre transition defense off of steals. They're 17th in the league in allowing teams to run off of opponent steals or off of Timberwolves turnovers is what that is. Live ball turnovers by the Wolves offense. And I mentioned the Ant play towards the end of regulation against the Clippers. I think it was a Terrence Mann dunk in the open floor. I think that's the play I'm thinking of. The live ball turnovers are just too frequent. And they were very damaging in both of these games. It doesn't pop out because it wasn't like, the Thunder game the week of Christmas when they turned it over 21 times or 23 times. Like, nobody would have just looked at this game and been like, it's turnovers, right? Because there's other factors. They missed a lot of open threes against the Clippers. That's certainly a factor. And obviously the fast break points that we already talked about, that's a major factor. But when the Clippers only commit 9 turnovers and you commit 15, and they get 19 fast break points to your 0 fast break points, those things work together to really matter in this game. And the Kings game on Friday, the Kings only turned it over 7 times in that game, in an overtime game. So we're talking 53 minutes of basketball. The Wolves only forced 7 Kings turnovers, and the Kings shot 50% from the field. Frankly, it was remarkable on some level that the Wolves were, in this thing late. So you combine a high frequency of turnovers on offense with lackadaisical and inconsistent, I guess it would be a kind way to put it, transition defense over the weekend. And you're fortunate when you look at an overtime loss on Friday and a 1-point loss with a chance to win at the end or a chance to tie at the end against the Clippers on Sunday. But those were the 2 biggest problems I had with this performance from the Wolves. And really the whole weekend. Turnovers, fast break points. I want to talk briefly about a rotation thing. And this was I'll reference Friday here in a moment, but this was a bigger deal to me on Sunday. The Wolves ended the first quarter up 30-18. And again, it was 30-15 before the prayer was answered from a tough Terrence Mann shot that gave the Clippers, got them to within 12. The Timberwolves up 12, start the second quarter without Karl-Anthony Towns or Anthony Edwards on the floor. Okay, so it was a lineup with it was Mike Conley, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Nas was on the floor, Kyle Anderson, and Rudy. Okay, that was the Timberwolves lineup to start the second quarter. So in that lineup, you're obviously relying on Nas Reid to score. That's kind of it, right? It's Nas to score. It's Conley and Nickeil Alexander-Walker to kind of, and Kyle Anderson. They're all play make first, and not as much Nickeil Alexander-Walker. But that is kind of the role he's played at times, right? He's essentially played backup point guard for stretches this year. None of those guys are generating their own offense with consistency. At this point in Conley's career, Alexander Walker, that's like the 3rd thing on his list after catch and shoot and initiate offense. Kyle Anderson, same thing. 3rd thing on his list, right? Or 2nd thing on his list, I guess, after playmaking. And Rudy isn't generating offense for himself. You're not running plays for him. So it's Nas. Like, he's the guy that's got to score. But they also didn't defend either. The Timberwolves were up 30-18 at the start of the second quarter. No Cat on the floor and no Ant on the floor. The Timberwolves called a timeout at the 8:58 mark. So 3 minutes and 2 seconds in to the second quarter. And it was a 13-0 Clippers run. They were up 30-18. A no Ant, no Cat lineup was outscored 13-0 in 3 minutes and 2 seconds. Okay, the Wolves' offensive possessions in there. Nas misses a shot in close that he easily could have made. I think it went in and out. Conley throws the ball out of bounds. Nas hits a 3 that then is overturned because he stepped out of bounds. So it was on an official scoring review, it was overturned. So Conley throws it out of bounds. Nas steps out of bounds. Kyle Anderson gets a shot blocked. Nas loses the ball out of bounds. I think that was the one that went between his legs, if I remember correctly. And then Rudy misses a shot in close, and then slow-mo turns it over. So you're talking 1, 2, 3 turnovers and 4 missed shots, including 2 that were blocked in that 3-minute stretch without Karl-Anthony Towns and without Anthony Edwards on the floor. And of course, for the Clippers, I mean, they had Paul George on the floor. I'm pretty confident either Paul George or Kawhi Leonard was on the floor at all times. And I know Ant's playing a ton of minutes. Cat's playing a lot of minutes too. But you got to have one of those guys on the floor at all times. On Friday against the Kings, same deal. The Timberwolves did that in the second quarter. They were actually down at the time, so I thought it was gutsy. And they played about 3 minutes then too, before Cat entered the game, nearly 3 minutes. And that lineup was a -2. They started down 8. They were down 10 when Cat came back in the game. So it was a -2 in 3 minutes, not quite the -13 that they were on Sunday. But that is playing with fire. It just is. And I love Chris Finch. I think for the most part, his rotations are okay. He's improved a ton over the last 2 years. But when you have two all-world scorers, two all-stars in Cat and Ant, I mean, how many teams would kill to have two guys that could score like that? You got to stagger their minutes in a way where one of them's, and I know Nas is a great scorer, and I know he provides punch off the bench, but he didn't against the Clippers. He was 0 for from the field against the Clippers. Regardless of that, like, you got to have one of those guys on the floor at all times. All right, I want to talk studs and duds, and a couple more thoughts from this one, and that's how we'll close this thing out. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends at Prize Picks. Prize Picks is America's #1 fantasy sports app with over 3 million members. They're the easiest and most exciting way to play DFS. It's just you against the numbers. You pick more than or less than on 2 to 6 player stat projections and watch the winnings roll in. It's demon time right now on Prize Picks. You can win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. That's right. You could turn $10 into $1,000. Demons and Goblins are the newest and most exciting way to play at Prize Picks. Squares marked with red demons or green goblins get you different payouts. You can now win up to 100 times your money with as little as 4 correct picks. Plus, they have injury insurance, so your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets hurt. For basketball games, if you have a player who exits in the first half and does not return in the second, the player projection won't count against you and the rest of your entry will stay live. Prize Picks is the only DFS platform with an injury insurance policy. Go to prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA and use the code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/LockedOnNBA, code LockedOnNBA for a first deposit match up to $100. Prize Picks, pick more, pick less. It's that easy. All right, a couple final thoughts here from this one, from Wolves Clippers specifically. The Timberwolves did not shoot the ball well, and I should mention that as one of the main issues, especially in the first half. It's part of the reason the Clippers ended up with that 3-point halftime lead. I mean, Jaden McDaniels, after scoring a career high on Saturday, he had 26, I think? Yeah, 26 on Saturday. He had just 6 points and missed all 4 of his 3-point attempts on Sunday, and they were mostly open. So McDaniels missed some open threes, Cat missed some open threes, Conley missed open threes, Ant missed open threes, Nas missed open threes. Like, as a team, they just did not shoot the ball well Sunday. They were 27% from outside the arc. Now, the Clippers are 29%, but that's clearly an area where the Wolves could have done some damage. And also, like, Norman Powell went nuts, and he hit 2 really tough end-of-quarter shots. He also had some wide-open shots. There was one right before a timeout, I think it was mid-fourth quarter, where Ant wasn't getting back quite quick enough in transition. Monte Morris tried to guard Kawhi to just kind of check him and put a body on him before he could cut to the basket, and couldn't get out to guard Norman Powell in time, and Ant didn't recognize it, didn't get out there. And this dude's literally, I think coming in was like 44.7% for 3, like a 45% 3-point shooter, the best 3-point shooter on the Clippers. And the Wolves just did not guard him in transition. And miscommunications happen, sure. But again, like, similar to that Ant play where he throws it away and the Clippers get a dunk the other way, which was also Norman Powell, you can't just give away wide open shots to 45% 3-point shooters or wide open dunks in transition to anybody in a game that's this close. When you're fighting tooth and nail on every possession in the half court, and actually played really well. They held the Clippers, who are a top 5 offensive team by any measure. They held them to 89 points on under 38% shooting, under 30% from 3. James Harden, by the way, had 0 made field goals in this game. He had 4 points on 10 shots, didn't make a single shot from the field, and the Wolves lost the game because their half-court defense was actually really, really, really good in this game, especially in the first quarter. But for 3 of the 4 quarters, it was basically just lockdown defense. It's the transition opportunities. We talked about transition already, but specifically the turnover that led to the Norman Powell dunk, the 3-pointer and the Norman Powell 3-pointer that I just talked about when Ant and Monte Morris miscommunicated. It's these kind of throwaway possessions that, like, there's a magnifying glass. And it's easy to say, everybody's overreacting online and they're going to be fine come playoff time. And I do believe that. I'm not saying they're going to win the title, but they're not going to, they'll be okay. They'll be fine in the playoffs. This doesn't mean this team's unserious or any of the other, adjectives you want to use to describe where this team's at. But there's a magnifying glass on possessions like this, like the ones I just mentioned, or like Friday when they were ahead of the Kings, end up forcing overtime. Obviously, no Ant after halftime. That could happen in the playoffs. What if somebody tweaks something and they're out the rest of the game, or gets hurt, or foul trouble, or whatever? It's not an excuse. Like, the Kings are playing without De'Aaron Fox. Like, that's a more than winnable game. It's a magnifying glass, right? Like, we could take all the information and be like, okay, well, Malik Monk went off on Friday. That's not going to happen every day. Well, guess what? James Harden isn't going to go 0 for every day either when you play the Clippers. So there's kind of these buts for all of these games. And clearly these things, like, what if Nas's heel doesn't head out of bounds in the Clippers game, right? What if Terrence Mann doesn't hit one of those crazy threes? What if, I don't know, like, there's multiple what ifs, right? This happens every single game. But when you're a team as good and as talented as the Wolves, there's just a magnifying glass on every one of these possessions. And it does matter. It does matter. All right, studs and duds on Sunday. Wolves Clippers. Anthony Edwards gets a stud. I know there were some rough moments. I mentioned the turnover, but overall, he was probably the best all-around player on the Wolves in this game. You could argue Rudy. I still think Ant played a really good game. And, you would have liked him, that dunk at the end of the game when they were down 3. He either needed to dunk it 3 seconds earlier, or he needed to just shoot the step back 3. And he unfortunately chose to not shoot the 3 and then dunk with 3 seconds left. And then the Wolves didn't get the foul in the last possession. That was not great. Overall, though, 27 points, 5 rebounds, 3 steals, 2 assists for Ant, 9 of 20 shooting, 3 of 10 outside the arc, 6 of 6 at the line. I thought it was a pretty good Ant game overall, in a game where the Wolves overall struggled to score. It's actually kind of hard to come up with 3 studs. I guess you could give one to Rudy. I thought he was better defensively on Sunday than he was on Friday against the Kings. There were some rough Rudy moments against the Kings, especially in the second half and overtime. But 12 and 16 for Rudy, 5 of 7 shooting, 3 blocks, 2 assists. I thought it was a pretty good overall Rudy game. I'm only going to do 2 studs. I mean, Cat had a nice line, 18, 9, and 8. But he came out on fire early in the first quarter. I think he had 12 points in the first quarter. Didn't score again until the fourth quarter. Had a decent close. But the middle of the game, Cat just vanished. So, like, he's not a stud or a dud in this one. Just kind of a weird Cat game, really, more than anything. The 8 assists are great. Had some nice passes toward the end. But I had an offensive rebound and slung a pass to the corner to Monte Morris. That was fun to see. But just not an overwhelmingly great Cat game. But it was just okay. Duds, I'm going to go Jaden McDaniels. I know he was great Friday against the Kings. 6 points on 9 shots in this game, missed all 4 3-pointers. And I know that James Harden was scoreless. I actually don't think McDaniels was great in this game defensively. He ended up on Kawhi a lot. And Kawhi had 32 on 26 shots, only turned it over a couple of times. And I don't know. I thought it was McDaniels has been a half step slow defensively for the most part. Obviously, the Kings game was great. The game before that, I thought he looked a little better overall. But this game, he struggled a little bit. I'm also going to, no, I guess that's kind of it. You could argue Nas. He did have 11 rebounds, second on the team, but he was 0 of 7 shooting, turned it over a couple of times. He was a minus 18 in a game the Wolves lost by 1. So an uneven Nas game, to be sure. I guess you could argue for a dud for him as well. Only 11 Monte Morris minutes, by the way, in the Clippers game, which I thought was interesting. He played 15 on Friday. I just expected him to maybe get a little bit more run Sunday. And I actually thought he played well, too. Knocked down a couple of corner threes in this one. All right, so I talked about kind of the big takeaways. The Wolves, obviously, they have Portland right now, like tonight. It's a quick turnaround, and then it's back to the road for Minnesota. So important to get this win. Again, they're 14.5-point favorites at FanDuel, but they have Portland Monday. They get 2 days off, and then it's at the Pacers on Thursday night. Is that right? Yeah, at the Pacers on Thursday night, which is also the front end of a road back-to-back. At the Cavs on Friday, and then they go all the way to LA from Cleveland next Sunday night. on ESPN. So next Sunday, a week from now, or I guess Monday show a week from now, we'll be talking about Wolves Lakers, but 3 games between now and then, starting with Portland on Monday night. All right, that's all we have for you today here on the show. A big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere. That includes YouTube as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. Wherever you like to listen to podcasts, you can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. And you can follow on X at Locked On T-Wolves and also at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. We'll be back on Tuesday with the post-game pod from Wolves Blazers, and of course the live postcast tonight on the Locked On Sports Minnesota YouTube channel. The audio right here on Locked On Wolves, you'll be able to hear that. Your next episode here in the feed will be the postcast from Wolves Blazers on Monday. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.